The rain in the city didn't just fall, it drowned the noise of the lower class, washing away the grit of the concrete until only the reflections of neon billboards remained. Julian Vance looked out from the tinted window of his Maybach, his eyes as cold as the glass separating him from the world outside. To Julian, time wasn't money, time was an empire. Every second wasted was a brick chipped away from the fortress he had spent 40 years building. He didn't see people, he saw assets, liabilities, and noise. And on this particular Tuesday evening, as the thunderstorm gridlocked the metropolitan traffic, the noise outside was growing unbearable. He adjusted his bespoke cufflinks, his mind already anchoring itself in the multi-million-dollar acquisition meeting scheduled for the next morning. The world outside his luxury vehicle could burn, so long as the smoke didn't tarnish his shoes. But then, the sound pierced through the heavy insulation of the luxury car. It wasn't the thunder, nor was it the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. It was a cry. A raw, piercing sob of a child, completely unshielded from the downpour. Julian's driver, Marcus, glanced nervously into the rearview mirror. "Sir, there's a boy on the curb. He's soaking wet. It looks like he's trying to get someone's attention." Julian didn't even look up from his tablet. "Keep driving, Marcus. The city is full of grifters. Give them an inch, and they'll strip the tires off the car while you're still sitting in it." "But sir, he's alone. He can't be more than 6 or 7, Marcus pressed gently, knowing the boundaries but pushed by a sudden wave of basic human empathy. "We are not a mobile charity, Marcus. We are late." Julian snapped, his voice cutting through the car's interior like a scalpel. He finally glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual calculated desperation of a street hustler. Instead, his eyes fell upon a small, shivering figure huddled beneath the awning of a closed, dilapidated jewelry store. The boy's clothes were rags, clinging to his frail frame, and he was weeping into his scraped hands. For a fleeting microsecond, something uncomfortable twinged in Julian's chest, a phantom echo of a life he had buried decades ago. But he quickly crushed it. Weakness was a disease, and Julian considered himself completely immune. He looked away, commanding the vehicle to move forward as the light turned green. However, the traffic gridlock had other plans. The Maybach moved barely 5 feet before coming to a grinding halt right in front of the boy. The child, sensing a presence, looked up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifyingly pure terror. He wasn't begging for money. He wasn't holding out a cup. He was clutching his own chest, sobbing out words that were muffled by the heavy rain and the glass. Julian tried to focus back on his financial spreadsheets, but the boy's gaze was magnetic in the worst way possible. It defied the unspoken rules of the city. The poor were supposed to be invisible, and background blur to the trajectory of the successful. This child was breaking the script. Frustrated by his own sudden inability to concentrate, Julian rolled the window down exactly 2 inches. The damp, frigid air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and misery. "Go home, kid," Julian said, his voice devoid of warmth. "The police will pick you up if you stay out here. Move along." The boy didn't run. Instead, he took a step closer to the car, pulling his hands away from his chest to wipe the rain from his eyes. As he did, the street lamp directly above flickered violently, casting a harsh, concentrated beam of amber light right onto the child's neck. Julian froze. The words died in his throat. Hanging from a frayed, dirty leather cord around the child's neck was a heavy, uniquely shaped silver pendant. It wasn't standard jewelry. It was a custom-milled piece of industrial silver, shaped like a fractured gear with a distinct, jagged crack running through the center, a flaw that had been deliberately preserved. Julian's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around his tablet so hard the screen creaked. That necklace wasn't just rare, it was impossible. It was a piece designed by Julian himself, 35 years ago, in a tiny, unheated basement apartment when he had nothing but a dream and a brother he swore he would never abandon. It was one of only 2 in existence. The other one was currently locked in Julian's private safe at his estate. The spreadsheets were forgotten. The multi-million-dollar acquisition vanished from his mind. The cold, impenetrable facade of the city's most ruthless billionaire cracked wide open in the span of a single heartbeat. "Marcus," Julian whispered, his voice suddenly sounding fragile, stripped of all its corporate authority. "Unlock the doors." "Sir?" Marcus asked, stunned by the sudden whiplash in his employer's demeanor. "I said open the door. Now." Julian roared, throwing his own door open before Marcus could even hit the central switch. He stepped out into the pouring rain, his expensive Italian leather shoes splashing into the dirty puddle on the asphalt, his custom suit absorbing the storm. He didn't care. His eyes were locked entirely on the silver gear resting against the boy's collarbone. The rain pelted Julian's face, blurring his vision, but the silver pendant remained terrifyingly sharp in his focus. He dropped to his knees right there on the wet pavement, completely oblivious to the mud ruining his tailored trousers. The child shrank back initially, startled by the sudden, frantic approach of the powerful man who had just ignored him seconds ago. The stark contrast between the billionaire's usual calculated restraint and this desperate display was staggering. "Where did you get this?" Julian demanded, his voice trembling as he reached out, his hands shaking violently. He stopped short of touching the boy, fearing he might scare him away. "Tell me right now. Who gave this to you?" The boy sniffled, his small shoulders shaking from both the cold and fear. He looked at Julian with large, tear-filled eyes, clutching the silver gear tightly in his tiny fist. It's my dad's," the boy whimpered, his voice cracking. "He told me never to take it off. He said it was the only thing that would protect me if he couldn't." Julian felt the ground tilt beneath him. His dad. The phrase echoed in his mind like a thunderclap. 35 years ago, Julian and his younger brother, Arthur, had carved those identical pendants out of a scrap piece of industrial silver they found in a junkyard. They had promised each other that no matter how rich or successful they became, they would never forget where they started. But when Julian's ambition turned into an obsession, he had betrayed Arthur, cutting him out of the company to secure absolute control. Arthur had walked away with nothing but the clothes on his back and his necklace, vowing never to look at Julian again. Julian had assumed Arthur was dead, or living in some far-off corner of the world. He never expected the past to hunt him down in the middle of a rain-slicked city street. "What is your father's name?" Julian asked, his chest tightening so hard he could barely draw breath. The suspense was suffocating. Every second the boy hesitated felt like an eternity. The audience watching this unfold would be screaming for the answer, hooked by the sudden unraveling of this ruthless tycoon. "His name is Arthur," the boy whispered. "Arthur Vance." The confirmation hit Julian like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, a wave of profound guilt and sudden, unexpected hope crashing over him. This boy wasn't just a stray child on the street, he was his nephew. The bloodline he thought he had completely severed was standing right in front of him, shivering in the dark. "Where is he?" Julian asked frantically, grabbing the boy's shoulders gently but firmly. "Where is your father, Arthur? Why are you out here alone?" The boy's face twisted in fresh agony, and he pointed a trembling finger toward the dark, narrow alleyway beside the abandoned jewelry store. "Some men in dark suits, they took him. They pushed him into a black van. He managed to throw me into the alley and told me to run, to look for someone who would recognize the gear. He said he'd come back, but it's been hours, and the rain won't stop." Julian stood up abruptly, his mind racing. The corporate titan was gone, in his place was a man fueled by a primal necessity to correct a lifelong mistake. He turned to Marcus, who had stepped out of the car with an umbrella, looking completely bewildered by the unfolding drama. "Marcus. Call our head of security, right now. Tell him to track every black van that left this sector within the last 3 hours. Use the corporate satellites, use the city traffic feeds, use whatever it takes." Julian ordered, his voice commanding and sharp once more, but this time, it was driven by desperate purpose. "Sir, what about the acquisition meeting?" Marcus asked, stunned. "Burn the meeting. Cancel the contract. I don't care if the company loses $1 billion tomorrow. Julian shouted, the rain washing over his face. He looked back down at the boy, extending his hand. Come with me, son. I'm going to find your father. I'm your uncle. The boy looked at Julian's outstretched hand, hesitant, but the sheer desperation and sincerity in the billionaire's eyes broke through his fear. He placed his small, freezing hand into Julian's large, warm palm. Julian lifted the boy up, holding him tight against his chest, shielding him from the storm as he hurried back into the Maybach. As the luxury car sped off into the rainy night, Julian stared out the window, his mind spinning. The hunter had become the protector. But as he looked down at the silver necklace resting against his nephew's chest, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The men who took Arthur, they weren't random criminals. The area where Arthur was taken was heavily monitored by Julian's own corporate rival, a ruthless conglomerate that had been trying to sabotage his acquisition for months. Did they know who Arthur was? Had they used his brother to get to him? The stakes had just skyrocketed from a family reunion to a dangerous corporate war, and Julian realized he was walking straight into a trap. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the risk to his fortune. He only cared about the blood on his hands, and the brother he had to save. The interior of the Maybach was warm, but the atmosphere remained freezing. The boy, whose name was Leo, sat wrapped in Julian's $1 million cashmere overcoat, sipping warm water that Marcus had provided. Julian sat opposite him, his eyes darting between his encrypted smartphone and the silver pendant around the boy's neck. His head of security, a former intelligence operative named Thomas, was already tracking the coordinates. Julian expected a standard ransom call. He expected a rival CEO to demand the acquisition assets in exchange for his brother's life. He was prepared to sign it all away. But then, the smartphone buzzed with an incoming secure video file from Thomas. Julian swiped the screen open, expecting to see street camera footage of a black van. Instead, the video feed displayed a live, hidden camera angle inside a high-security warehouse owned by Vance Enterprises, Julian's own company. Julian's breath caught in his throat. The camera panned over to show Arthur tied to a heavy steel chair beneath a harsh halogen bulb. His face was bruised, but his eyes still held that stubborn, fiery resilience Julian remembered from their youth. Standing over Arthur, however, wasn't a rival executive or a hired mercenary. It was Harrison Vance, Julian's own 28-year-old son and the designated heir to the Vance empire. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The contrast between his absolute trust in his son and this horrific reality shattered his reality. Harrison was holding a tablet, casually scrolling through financial data while two security guards, men Julian paid to protect his family, stood watch at the doors. You really should have stayed hidden, Uncle Arthur, Harrison's voice echoed through the phone speaker, smooth, chillingly calm, and completely devoid of empathy. My father spent 35 years pretending you didn't exist. If you suddenly reappear now, with your sob story about family values, it ruins the narrative. It complicates the inheritance. More importantly, it threatens the merger I've spent 3 years setting up behind my father's back. Arthur spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete floor, laughing weakly. You're just like him, Harrison. Cold. Calculating. You see the world in profit margins. But your father at least had a soul once. He remembers what it's like to have nothing. You're just a parasite feeding on his legacy. Harrison didn't flinch. He walked up to Arthur, tapping the screen of his tablet. My father is getting soft, Uncle. He actually hesitated when he saw the acquisition numbers today. He's sentimental. But I am not. Once I finalize this merger with our competitors, I will control the board. You, however, are a loose end. And that little brat of yours who ran away. Don't worry, my men are tracking him down right now. By midnight, the Vance bloodline will be perfectly streamlined. The video feed cut out as Thomas's voice came over the audio line. Sir. I'm sorry. Harrison intercepted our primary security codes. He's the one who ordered the abduction. He's planning to force Arthur to sign over a fraudulent claim to old family assets, which will trigger a clause to strip you of your voting power on the board. We have a location, but Harrison has the entire Alpha security team with him. If we move in with local police, he'll know, and he'll liquidate the asset. By asset, I mean your brother. Julian dropped the phone onto the leather seat. The twist was a knife in his back, twisted by his own flesh and blood. The very corporate monster he had created, the ruthless philosophy he had drilled into his son, eliminate all liabilities, had just come back to destroy the only real family he had left. Julian looked across the car at Leo, who was watching him with wide, innocent, trusting eyes. The boy had no idea that his own cousin was the one holding his father hostage. He had no idea that the empire his uncle built was the very cage holding his father captive. Uncle Julian? Leo whispered, clutching the silver gear. Are we going to save my dad? Julian looked down at his own hands. For decades, these hands had signed hostile takeovers, destroyed competitors, and accumulated billions. They were clean, manicured, and completely useless in a fight. But looking at Leo, and hearing the echoes of his son's betrayal, a cold, terrifying resolve washed over the billionaire. He realized that to save his brother, he had to completely destroy the very empire he spent his life creating. He had to play the monster one last time, not for profit, but for blood. Marcus, Julian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous whisper. Change of plans. Don't go to the safe house. Drive directly to the central power grid at the docks. We are going to shut down the Vance grid. If Harrison wants to play in the dark, let's see how he handles the shadows. The heavy steel doors of the Vance industrial warehouse groaned as they were thrown open, not by a SWAT team, but by the lone figure of Julian Vance. The power grid had been severed, the entire facility was illuminated only by the sweeping emergency red lights and the relentless flashes of lightning from the storm outside. The shadows stretched long and menacing across the concrete floor. Harrison stood near the center platform, flanked by 4 armed security guards. Arthur remained tied to the chair, his breathing shallow, his face illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of the crimson emergency beacons. Ah, Father, Harrison said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, completely unbothered by the darkness. He held a high-caliber handgun loosely at his side. I figured Thomas would track us here. I also figured you'd be foolish enough to come alone. Did you bring the signed transfer of voting rights? Or did you come to give me another lecture on corporate synergy? Julian walked forward, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. He looked completely disheveled, his suit soaked, his hair matted to his forehead, yet he carried an aura of absolute authority that made the guards visibly shift their weight. I brought nothing, Harrison, Julian said, stopping 20 feet away. Except an ending. Then you brought your own, Harrison sneered, raising the weapon, pointing it directly at Julian's chest. It's poetic, really. The great Julian Vance, undone by the very ruthlessness he taught his son. You always said, if an asset becomes a liability, liquidate it. Uncle Arthur is a liability. And now, Father, so are you. The board will believe you died in a tragic accident trying to save your long-lost, unhinged brother from a warehouse fire. Arthur raised his head, screaming through his cracked lips, Julian, run. He's insane. He's not going to let either of us leave here alive. But Julian didn't move. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, a look of pure, calculated triumph that stopped Harrison in his tracks. The contrast between a cornered man and a man who had already won sent a shiver through the room. You think you're a monster, Harrison? You're just a child playing with his father's tools, Julian said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic remote device. You think you intercepted my security protocols to kidnap Arthur? I let you. I've known about your back-alley dealings with our competitors for 6 months. I knew you were embezzling funds, and I knew you were planning a coup. But I needed a reason to wipe you off the board permanently without triggering a shareholder panic. Harrison's eyes narrowed, his confidence suddenly faltering. You're bluffing. You love this company too much to risk it. I loved the company until tonight, Julian replied, his voice dropping to a freezing whisper. Until I saw what it turned you into. Until I realized what it cost my brother. The moment I stepped out of my car into the rain, I didn't just decide to save Arthur. I decided to destroy you. Julian pressed the button on the remote. Suddenly, the overhead industrial monitors flickered to life, powered by an independent backup loop. But they didn't show stock prices or corporate logos. They showed a live broadcast feed of the entire warehouse, the guards, the weapons, Harrison's face, streaming directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the local police department, and every major news network in the country. This isn't a kidnapping negotiation, Harrison. It's a live-streamed federal confession, Julian revealed, his voice echoing with absolute finality. Every word you said to Arthur, every security protocol you breached, and the weapons your men are currently holding are being broadcast to 50 million people right now. The police are already breaching the outer perimeter. Harrison panicked, looking up at the screens, his face turning a sickly pale color under the red lights. You ruined the Vance name. The stock will plummet to zero by morning. You've destroyed the empire. Let it burn, Julian said, taking a step forward, completely ignoring the gun still pointed at him. I built it from nothing. I can watch it turn to ash. But you will never touch a single cent of it, and you will spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell, realizing you were outplayed by the man who taught you the game. The sound of shattering glass and blaring police sirens suddenly erupted from the front gates. The guards instantly dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender as tactical teams flooded the building. Harrison stared at his father in absolute horror, realizing his empire, his freedom, and his future had vanished in the blink of an eye. He dropped the gun, his knees buckling as the police tackled him to the floor. Julian didn't even look at his son as he was dragged away in handcuffs. He walked straight past the chaos, moving directly toward the chair where his brother sat. The chaotic rush of tactical gear, shouting police officers, and flashing blue lights faded into a dull, distant blur as Julian knelt before the steel chair. With trembling fingers, he produced a pocketknife and sliced through the heavy zip ties binding Arthur's wrists. The moment the plastic snapped, Arthur collapsed forward, exhausted and broken, but Julian caught him. The two brothers, separated by 35 years of silence, pride, and corporate greed, held onto each other as the storm outside slowly began to break. I'm sorry, Artie, Julian whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken since they were teenagers in that unheated basement apartment. I'm so sorry. I let the gold blind me. I forgot what we were actually building all of this for. Arthur gripped Julian's soaked suit jacket, his voice thick with emotion. You came back for me, Jules. That's all that matters. But where is Leo? Is he? He's safe. He's in the car with Marcus, Julian reassured him quickly, helping Arthur stand up. He's the one who saved you. If it wasn't for him, if it wasn't for the necklace, I would have driven right past. Julian supported his brother's weight as they walked out of the warehouse, leaving the ruins of Vance Enterprises behind them. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the dispersing storm clouds, casting a soft, golden hue over the city. The contrast between the cold, dark night they had just survived and the warmth of the dawn was profound. The media would wake up to the biggest corporate scandal of the decade, the downfall of a multi-billion-dollar dynasty, but as Julian looked at the horizon, he felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't experienced in decades. He was finally free from the golden cage. When they reached the Maybach, the door flew open before they could even touch the handle. Leo scrambled out, his eyes lighting up as he saw his father walking toward him. Dad! Leo cried out, sprinting across the wet asphalt. Arthur dropped to his knees, catching his son in a fierce, tearful embrace, burying his face in the boy's damp hair. I'm here, buddy. I'm here. I told you I'd come back. Julian stood a few paces back, watching the display of pure, unconditional love. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his own silver pendant, the identical twin to the one around Leo's neck. It was pristine, polished, and completely devoid of the scratches and wear that gave Arthur's necklace its character. Julian realized his life had been exactly like his pendant, perfect on the surface, but completely lacking life. He walked over to the father and son, dropping to his knee beside them. He took his own necklace and placed it gently in Leo's small hand. "Keep this one too, Leo," Julian said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Consider it your first asset. But remember, the most valuable things in this world can never be bought, sold, or traded." Arthur looked up at his brother, the old resentment completely washed away by the rain, replaced by a deep, silent understanding. The Vance family name no longer belonged to a corporate empire or a line on a stock ticker. It belonged to them, right here on the concrete, rebuilding from the ground up. As the car drove away, leaving the flashing police lights behind, the silver gears jingled softly in the quiet interior, finally reunited, closing the loop of a bond that time, greed, and storms could never truly break.